A reminder before we begin this meeting that this meeting is being recorded. My name is Shayla Funk and I'm an analyst in the Safety Policy Division, and this is the Track 1 Technical Working Group meeting number 2. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss transparency guidelines for assumptions and estimates for risk-based decision-making framework filings. The conversation around transparency guidelines came about during the December 15th workshop on Track 1. And we're here today to solely focus on addressing how assumptions and estimates are presented in RDF filings. We're not here to discuss how to represent uncertainty in RDF filings, as discussed in part in the first Track 1 Technical Working Group meeting on February 3rd. Looking at the agenda, we're going to start off with discussing a work plan for this topic. And then we are going to jump into a presentation provided by Turn on transparency guidelines, and then we'll hop into discussion. During discussion, we'll most likely take a 5-minute break to break up the meeting a little bit. And then finally, we'll wrap up with next steps towards the end of the meeting. A friendly reminder, since everyone has control of their mic, please mute yourself when you're not speaking. If your mic is left unmuted, then IT will be here to kind of help support and put you on mute. If you have any technical issues during this meeting, you could direct message anyone on the IT list, or you can direct message Alicia Russell. You could also call a number 415-703-5263 if any of these other communication methods aren't working for you. If you'd like to engage in conversation, please use the raise hand function, or you could unmute yourself at the appropriate time. I'd like to thank Katie Morsoni for providing us a presentation today and the time she took in crafting it. And finally, before we jump into the work plan, I want to talk about our goal of the meeting. We have a goal of identifying a work plan and schedule for transparency guidelines, and we are hoping to identify some improvements to transparency guidelines today and have an agreed upon next steps as a group. So before we hop into the work plan, I'd like to open it up to any questions. Hearing none, with that introduction on today's topic, I want to open up discussion on the work plan. SPD would like to propose to the group that a member of the technical working group or a group of technical working group members take the initiative to start drafting a working document of the proposed transparency guidelines based on today's discussion and, if needed, at future technical working group meetings. The document will be shared among technical working group members, and it will be a collaborative process. So I'm going to open it up to everyone to see if anyone would like to volunteer for this initiative.
This is Katie. I think we'll get there when we go through our slides, but I think we've provided a good starting point for that discussion with our suggestion on how we can start reporting on assumptions and estimates a little more clearly. So I'd be happy to be a part of that working group.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone else want to join Katie or have any additional comments? Hearing none, thank you, Katie, for volunteering to spearhead the draft proposed transparency guidelines. And with that, I believe we could jump into your presentation. And we could talk about, sorry, one more thing. Before we do that, we could talk about schedule at the end in the next steps section.
Great. First, Chuck and Jonathan, can I do a mic and video check for you guys to make sure Chuck Feinstein and Jonathan Lesser are both on?
This is Chuck, I'm on.
Great.
This is Jonathan. I'm here.
Great. Well, I would like to thank Shayla and the commission staff for giving us the opportunity to present this morning on transparency of estimates and assumptions. And I'd also like to thank Chuck and Jonathan for all of their help in putting these slides together. It was definitely not just me. I very much appreciate them. So if we want to bring up our slide deck for the group, thank you. And excuse me if I'm looking off to the side. I'm working with two monitors and I have my slides open on one. So I apologize. We're going to get the first slide. The first couple of slides in this deck actually are just pulled directly from the settlement that was adopted by the commission that discusses how the RAMP or the risk-based decision-making framework should operate, and things should be presented in the RAMP and the GRC. And I've just highlighted some language that I think provides important context for what's to come. Notably, when SME or subject matter expert judgment is used, the process that SMEs undertook to provide their judgment should be described. And that the utility should specify all information and assumptions that are used to determine both pre and post mitigation risk scores. So under the settlement, the information on assumptions and estimates is directed to be provided. If you want to go to the next slide. The settlement also says that the utility will identify critical parameters and assumptions made in performing the risk analysis and explain why such parameters are critical. Again, this is information that's helpful for the commission and other interveners to understand the decisions that are driven by the results of the risk-based decision-making framework. If we want to go to the next slide. SME judgment should be used if methodologies require the use of data that is not available. So when we think it's really important to acknowledge what we don't know, but that it's also important to give context to that. And that's what, as you'll see through the rest of our slides, our intent is to provide context for the information that's provided. All right, so if we want to go to the next slide. Our goal in transparency is that we create a scenario where the results of the risk-based decision-making can be repeated or replicated by a third party. So basically, by taking the information that you have, we can come to roughly the same result. We understand that there's going to be some discretion in there. We understand that the decisions that the utility may make may be driven by other things that are outside of the risk-based decision-making framework, but the results of the settlement process have always been intended to be a baseline for understanding those decisions. So we should, as a third party or the commission, have the ability to run through the process and get to roughly the same results. This allows us to test the different assumptions, see if one assumption changes a little bit or a lot, how that drives the results or doesn't drive the results. And it gives a lot of context to the decisions that the utility is making. But in order to do that, we need to both understand the process that was used, but also understand all of the inputs to that process. I want to go to the next slide. So, as I said earlier, uncertainty is a really important point of information. It's really important to know what we don't know, and sometimes acknowledging what we don't know helps us identify the value of determining that that input with more specificity, doing some research into it, doing some studies or inspections. As a note, in the JIA test drive that we did in R.20-07-013, the report actually goes through the fact that that test drive identified not just the asset management strategy, but as part of that asset management strategy where additional testing and data would provide important information for the utility to make decisions in the future. Next slide, please. Something that we've noticed in our experience going through this is that granularity truly informs transparency. If you're not identifying your assets or your strategies with enough granularity, you are going to run the risk of masking the impact of particular mitigations or masking the risk reflected by a certain asset. So to the extent that you have granular information, that granular information should be visible in the results. Using average RSE values that are not accounting for individual asset differences doesn't allow the commission or interveners to make recommendations that are fine-tuned about what mitigations are chosen, or even if we agree that a mitigation is the best choice, the proper scope for that work, or whether by making changes to that scope and adding inspections or other lower cost mitigations, we can optimize the spending of ratepayer dollars. So for that reason, we think both individual assets need to be looked at, and also mitigations should not be rolled together and looked at as a suite of mitigations. You need to look at each mitigation on its own. And in addition to that, we think incrementality is important. By that, I mean, looking at if there's mitigations A, B, and C, and they're going to be deployed in order A, B, and C, you should show the mitigation impact of A, and then the incremental impact of B, and the incremental impact of C, so that we can see exactly what each mitigation is getting us. That way you can also, change the order and see if you get a different result that perhaps is a better result for ratepayers. But it's important to be applying those in order so you can see the impact of each mitigation. Next slide, please. So here are some really high level kind of reflections on how the utility can be transparent about how they're describing certain inputs. For each input, they can identify whether it is based on an assumption or an estimate. They can define with specificity exactly what is being assumed or estimated. Once you've identified that there's something to be assumed or estimated, you can explain the basis or source for that estimate. Was it based on national data, or was it based on surveying a number of SMEs? You can identify with your confidence surrounding that assumption or estimate. So for example, if it was based on a variety of SMEs, you can say, 7 SMEs told us that it would likely result in X, and they're pretty confident about it. So we at least know that that was a reasonable SME judgment that was reflected with high confidence. On the other end of that, and I'm sure Chuck and Jonathan will correct me on some of this later, but on the other end of that, if our SMEs aren't particularly confident and they provide a range of different potential inputs, that gives us a clue that that might be a really important point of data to be researching or gathering via inspection. Similarly, when you rely on an assumption or estimate, giving a reasoning why it's a reasonable assessment, why you think that that national data, if you use that, for example, applies well to your utilities system or the asset in question. And then identifying whether the assumption or estimate is uncertain. So what's the range of the potential that was considered in the assumption or the estimate? So next slide. So this is from the settlement. The settlement requires a risk-spend efficiency to be calculated, and that requires both a pre-mitigation likelihood of risk event and consequence of risk event, and a post-mitigation likelihood of risk event and consequence of risk event that reflect the impact of implementing a proposed mitigation. So the utility, in order to give those two values, has to determine what the effectiveness of the mitigation will be. And they may know with specificity what the effectiveness of a given mitigation will be, or they may be relying on an estimate what they think is going to happen. But unless the utility provides context for the value that they use to identify the post-mitigation lower and core, stakeholders and the commission can't really identify whether that value is reasonable. If they don't give us the information that was on the last slide, where it came from, what the sources were, et cetera, it's hard for us to judge. So what I'm going to pass it over to Chuck in just a minute, but I wanted to give you some context for what we're going to go through next. TURN has been thinking a lot about ways that we can highlight the use of assumptions and estimates in the RAMP filings, so that rather than going through extra rounds of discovery or having to ask a lot of questions, we can streamline that need by presenting assumptions and estimates in a more clear way with some background information. And so what we've been working towards is coming up with a streamlined format for presenting estimates and assumptions. And we think this is an attempt, at this point, we're not trying to change the settlement. We know that assumptions and estimates are going to be used, as are reflected in the first couple of slides. We're just trying to find a clearer way to draw out where those assumptions and estimates have been used and what they are, so that parties in the commission can assess their reasonableness. So with that, I'll say next slide and hand it over to Chuck.
Thanks. Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. This is Chuck Feinstein. I am a consultant for TURN. In the streamlined format that we're talking about, we're basing this discussion on our experiences in trying to replicate as a third party what PG&E, for example, presented. The first thing that should be reported is a variable that's used for all analysis, and that's the discount rate. Second thing that should be reported is that for each mitigation, you need to specify what mitigation does and what the situation was before the mitigation didn't come to be implemented. So the first thing you have to specify is a time horizon. We've agreed that the time horizon of analysis can vary for mitigation. For each period in the time horizon, typically a year, the cost of the mitigation has to be specified. And so you need numbers from periods 1, 2, 3 up to T for the cash flows. The consequence of a risk event is described by the various attribute levels. So in every year up through T, for each attribute, before and after the mitigation, the level of the attribute in natural units has to be specified. That level of that attribute can be uncertain, it can be deterministic, and I hasten to say, by the way, that the cost in any year can also be uncertain or deterministic, whatever utility chooses to report. And the third main thing that you have to report is the likelihood of occurrence of the risk event. And again, that is the likelihood of occurrence of the risk event for each year in the planning period, both before and after the mitigation. So what you have here is a matrix. And the matrix has capital T columns and a number of rows that's equal to 1 for the time horizon, 1 for the cost, 2 for the likelihoods, and 2 times n sub a, where n sub a is the number of attributes. So if there are 3 attributes, then altogether what you need is 1 plus 6 plus 2 rows in a matrix that has T columns. That's on the next slide. Perhaps we could go there, please. And so you see this displayed as a matrix. And so in every one of these cells, there has to be something. That something could be a number if the cost or the consequence or the likelihood is known. It could be a probability distribution. It could be a collection of probability distributions depending on what you are uncertain about. But the point is that it ought to be displayed in a matrix like this so that a third party like us can look at it and figure out what the inputs and the assumptions are. If we had this, we could make all the computations we need to determine whether or not we agree or disagree with what was reported. Now, the next 3 slides in this presentation or in the slide pack describe, could we have the next one, please? Describe how to report uncertainty. There are 3 slides. One describes the uncertainty and the costs. The second one describes the uncertainty and the consequences. The third one describes uncertainty and the likelihoods. We've had a lot of discussion in this working group so far about uncertainty and what it means and where it arises and how to describe it. And it's my suggestion that we continue that discussion, maybe today, maybe at another time. But I do believe we need a session, and this is not Turn's position, it's mine personally, but we need a session to describe what we mean by uncertainty, because in my opinion, there's a lot of confusion about this. And I don't want to go through all these slides right now. If you'd like, I can at any time. And if we can go down 3 slides, please. So we have the costs, then the consequences, and then the likelihood. You can read these slides at your leisure. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has any. And then we get to the risk.
Chuck, can I just step in real quick and say our intent in those 3 slides is really just to provide more context on what we think would be included in the chart on slide 11. So those are describing the inputs that would be reflected in that streamlined format for reporting estimates.
Thanks, Katie. And every one of these cells in the matrix can be really a collection of things. It could be numbers, it could be probability distributions, it could be anything you have to describe the particular input that we need. But whatever description it is, it should be complete in a way that we can make the computation as a third party. Now, what we're ultimately after, according to the settlement, is the risk-spend efficiency. We know that the risk-spend efficiency is a ratio of 2 present values. So if we have the risk reduction in each period, and if we have the cost in each period, we can compute the risk-spend efficiency. Obviously, the present value of any of these is simply the discounted value of the numbers in the row of each, in the appropriate row in the matrix. We also know that the risk in each period is a product of what? Well, it's a product of the likelihood of the risk event multiplied by the consequence of the risk event. But in fact, the way it has been implemented, the likelihood of the risk event can be a probability if the event can occur at most once in a year, or it can be an expected number of occurrences of the event if the event can occur more than once a year. The consequences is the expected weighted scaled value of all of the attributes in the multi-attribute value function. And so what we have as the risk is the present value of the likelihood multiplied by the consequences. The risk reduction then is the difference between the present value of the risk before the mitigation and the present value of the risk after the mitigation. And that's an expectation. The present value of the cost is the present value of the expected cost in each period. The ratio of those is the risk-spend efficiency. That means, next slide, please, that we can report, and this is what we hope to see, we can report the risk-spend efficiency in terms of its component numbers. First, you can report the present value of the cost, and that could be the expected present value. Second, you can report the present value of the risk before mitigation. That's just the product of the likelihood multiplied by the consequences before the mitigation. And third, you can report the present value of the risk after mitigation. So that's again the likelihood times the consequences after the mitigation. And you notice that here we're just looking for 3 numbers. And the reason we're looking for 3 numbers is because by definition, there is no uncertainty in the risk-spend efficiency unless there's uncertainty in the probability distributions that describe the cost, the consequences, the likelihoods. And those uncertainties are discussed in the slides that we went over very quickly, skipped over. So what we would need to replicate everything as a third party is that matrix of 15 capital T columns and 1 plus 2 times n sub a rows, and then 3 more numbers. And that has to be shown for our purposes for every mitigation. And that completes, I think, what is the simplest way that we think of for reporting the results and the assumptions and the inputs. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think the general idea is, to the extent that we understand and acknowledge that assumptions and estimates are going to be used in this process, and we can talk about that more through, you know, this and later phases of the proceeding. But our intent today was really just to come up with a process for drawing out those numbers where they are, so that third parties in the commission can look more closely at them, rather than having to have a, you know, like I said, many rounds of discovery, et cetera, to identify what all the different, you know, assumptions and estimates that were relied on were. So I think that's what we like to present today. I see a question that I am going to throw over to Chuck, because I do not know the answer. Why can't you use an accumulated number rather than annual numbers?
I don't know what an accumulated number means. What is the, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
The question is what you want to do, values for every year of the life of the mitigation. Why can't you just do it for a total for the full life of the mitigation for all the years? And so you have one number instead of multiple numbers, which could be like for 25 years.
Well, if by the total number you mean the cumulative effect over, say, 25 years, if you knew how to do that, that's fine. But if that's not what you mean, I don't understand the question.
So you want the lore and the core for every year of the mitigation, is that correct?
Yes.
Why can't you accumulate it over the life of the mitigation and then measure that as for the risk spend efficiency rather than doing annual risk spend efficiencies?
You don't do annual risk spend efficiencies. The data is described annually. The risk spend efficiency is a single number, which is the ratio of the present values of all of the data.
Okay,
So,
you're calculating risk every year, the risk before and the risk after?
yes.
Or maybe, okay. But you can't do accumulated risk before and accumulated risk after to see over the life of the mitigation, how it comes out?
So, hey, Marty, this is Steve here. I would like to just jump in quickly. The discount factors are different, so you can't just apply this one discount factor to the total. So the time value of money is different for every single increment, annual single increment. So that's why you can't just accumulate it and apply a discount factor. Chuck, is that right?
That's part of the answer. The other part of the answer is things can change every year. Another part of the answer is to compute the cumulative effect of something, whether you discount or not, over something like 25 years is a very difficult computation. The standard practice in a situation like this is simply to describe what happens in every period. And the conventional period in this analysis is 1 year. So if you have a mitigation that lasts 10 years, then you have to describe what's going to happen in each year of the 10 over which the mitigation lasts.
This is Vincent from PG&E. Maybe a clarification on Martin's question. I think if you go back to the slide with the matrix, I think Martin's saying, why don't we just put a column on the right side of the matrix that's basically the sum of all the columns in each row of the matrix and report just that column. I think that's what he meant by accumulation. And if you go back to that slide on the matrix, I wanted to ask a question, a subsequent question, which is basically, I noticed that you wanted to see core reported in natural units and not the scale units. So I just wanted to clarify that.
You could report it in scaled units if you like. You could also report it in natural units. What we're most concerned about is the natural units, because as a third-party replicator, we'll perform our own calculations, converting the natural units into the scaled units using the multi-attribute value function. And based on your clarification of the first point, if you were to accumulate every value in every period and present that in each of the rows, then Steve Haynes' point, of course, becomes apparent, that we don't know how those vary from period to period, and therefore we'd be unable to discount them.
Well, and this is Katie, from the lawyer perspective too. I think there's some value in keeping some of these things separate because it helps us understand the mitigation better. And, you know, if a lot, I'm speaking very inartfully, but if a lot of the mitigation impact is front loaded, or if it's a little bit each year, or I think for me, at least, being able to see that time horizon gives me a better understanding of how the mitigation is going to operate.
Let me also say that Vincent, because Vincent mentioned this, this is exactly what PG&E, for example, did. They presented all these numbers. The difficulty was it wasn't transparent because we had to find them. We had to look around in various places in what PG&E presented to find out what the value was in each year. And then we found ourselves guessing just a little bit too, because it wasn't exactly clear. So that's why we proposed this format, because it's transparent, it's obvious, and it gets at everything we need.
Another thing I want to point out, Chuck, that if we use a nonlinear scaling function, then if you show the in the matrix, if you show the core in terms of natural units, you wouldn't be able to use the scaling function that we have to replicate the core number in scale units, as you know.
Yes, thank you for that comment. In fact, that's not correct for our purposes. We can do that. We can take your nonlinear scaling function and replicate quite nicely what you computed using simulation or whatever it was. So that's not an issue for us. All we need is a clear specification of the inputs. But I only speak now for the computations that Turing did. I'm not speaking for any other third-party replicator.
We have a couple more questions that have come in through the chat function that I was hoping to pose to Chuck and Jonathan. One is, RSE is always uncertain as cost, lore, and core have uncertain probability distributions. Why is this presented as a question implying there may be cases where there is no uncertainty in cost, lore, and core?
Two things in that statement are important. The cost, the likelihood, and the consequences can be uncertain. When they are uncertain, then the expected values of those uncertain quantities are not uncertain. It therefore follows that the risk-spend efficiency is not uncertain in that case. However, and this is what's in slides 12, 13, and 14, if you say that you're going to report, say, the consequence as a probability distribution on the level of an attribute in natural units, and you are uncertain about the parameters of that probability distribution, like say its mean or its variance, then you are perfectly within your capabilities and rights and the settlement to write down a probability distribution on the uncertain mean. No problem. Write down a probability distribution on the uncertain variance. Also no problem. In that case, and only in that case, if you have uncertainty about the probability distribution itself, is the risk-spend efficiency uncertain. So the mere fact that the cost, the likelihood, and the consequences are themselves uncertain does not imply that the risk-spend efficiency is uncertain. It is not. But when you're uncertain about the probability distributions themselves, that's a second order of uncertainty, in which case the risk-spend efficiency is indeed uncertain.
The next question is, how can you tell if an event can occur only once a year?
That depends on the event and depends on what you're willing to assume about it. It could be that an event occurs that is so destructive that it cannot possibly occur again because it's destroyed everything in its wake. For example.
Are there any more questions on Turn's presentation?
Chuck, this is Steve here. You mentioned you skipped over several slides on uncertainty, and I personally have some interest in looking at what you may want to say on those slides. Is there sufficient time, Shayla, to allow Chuck to present those several slides that he omitted?
I think it would be best if perhaps we circled back to it towards the end of the conversation, and maybe we could focus on the initial proposed changes that Turn had in mind and see if we can come to agreement or start discussion on those. And then
Okay.
towards the end, if we have time, then perhaps he could present on the slide.
Okay, sure. Okay.
And, Shayla, I just want to follow up and make it clear that Turn doesn't view this as a change. We view this as an additional layer of providing information that would streamline review of the risk assessment and mitigation phase. We're really hoping, we know that there's things that we're going to change maybe eventually, but right now this is us just trying to pull out additional information to better understand the results.
Definitely. I see a hand up in the participants chat for Brian Landry.
Hey, Shayla. So this is Brian Landry. Thank you guys for presenting today. So I just have a level setting question here today. I think you began the conversation today that stating that uncertainty would be out of scope for today's discussion. Yet what I'm hearing is that a lot of discussion about uncertainty. So if we can get some clarification on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so in other words, what we're really looking for, or what guidelines should utilities go by to best communicate their use and reliance on assumptions and varying levels of data quality and availability. The part of the uncertainty portion, I think it was a little bit discussed in our last technical working group meeting. But for the focus of today's, that's what we're really hoping to get out of the meeting.
Okay, thank you. So again, just for level setting, so this is Brian Landry from Southern Edison. So I saw a lot of, the reason I'm kind of confused is I saw a lot of sort of material after this slide, specifically on uncertainty. So that's why I'm kind of confused.
Brian, sorry, Shayla, I was just going to say, Brian, I think as Chuck noted, those slides where it was maybe going more into uncertainty was talking about when there is uncertainty, how to report the information in slide 11. It was, what information about those assumptions and estimates would inform slide 11 rather than a deeper discussion of it.
I got you. So that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarifying it, because so what I'm understanding is that when there is uncertainty, simply a way to report this information and not necessarily what's an adequate threshold. Is that correct?
That seems correct. Okay. I guess I would say to be totally clear, like slide 11, when you fill that slide out, or in your ramp, if you were to fill out a chart that looked like this, you know, each cell may not necessarily be a single number. It could be a you know, a couple of points of information and data. And the type of information and data that would maybe be in that cell is what's described in those slides that followed. And those are meant to be, I think, sort of just a way to draw out that type of information.
I got you. Thank you. And I think that's maybe some other people in the panel. I think this is maybe where their question is going to. So thanks for that clarification.
So what I think might be a good plan of action for discussion is maybe, Katie, since you're leading the initiative of drafting the proposed guidelines, if we want to go back to your earlier slide, I think slide 8 had some points on there. And if we want to open those up for discussion to hear what other people think of them, or if they have any amendments or additions or concerns, and perhaps we could start going through your proposed clarifications and see where there's agreement or thoughts.
Shayla, this is Mason Withers from SDG&E. I think at the beginning of the meeting, we were kind of going fast, and I don't think all of us understood what this working group panel that Katie volunteered for was about. I think maybe we should have some more time to think about the implications of who's on that panel before we proceed.
Definitely. So would you like, oh, sorry, Katie. Oh, so would you like to open up talking about who would like to be on the panel for drafting the proposed transparency guidelines, Mason?
Well, maybe like Ryan from Edison, I'm still trying to level set like what we think this applies to. You know, we're filing our ramp in 2 months, and these added requirements that are being suggested now are new to us, and if it's expected to be in our May filing, I'd like to know that like today, because I don't know why we would be adding requirements at this late hour for us. So if the intent of this working group is to establish new requirements that are on top of the settlement agreement for the next ramp, I think that's something we should talk about. Does this apply to Edison because they're a year from now? I don't know what it applies to. So
Shayla, go to the slide 2 in the presentation. It's the settlement line 29 slide. So I think it's not adding new requirements, Mason. The settlement requires when SME judgment is used, the process that the SMEs undertook to provide their judgment should be described. The settlement requires the utility should specify all informations and assumptions that are used to determine both pre and post mitigation risk scores. So this is not a new requirement. This is a way of presenting those 2 lines of information that's already required in the settlement. You know, I think the alternative is you could get a data request right after it comes out and 10 days later provide us that information.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we agree that settlement line 29 is the critical part of the settlement agreement, but the specific application of how we would do that is an additional requirement. So I just want to make sure we're all saying the same thing and who it affects and what's the timing that it affects.
But I don't understand how it's an additional requirement if we're just highlighting where required information is being provided.
Well, you know, for example, Chuck just gave a table of how to show your data, and there was lots of thoughts around how to populate that. It sounded like you said there could be 1, there could be 2. That's not spelled out in the settlement agreement. So I think maybe that's an example of how you might do it, but I don't think having a requirement that you should do it that way, it is an additional requirement. I think that's pretty clear. So, I mean, if you want us to follow 29, I think we're doing that already. And if there's specific ways to follow 29, that would be an additional requirement. I think that's pretty clear. So I just want to make sure that we're saying the same thing here. We're not trying to expand the settlement agreement. We're trying to ensure that the interpretation of it is something that we all agree to. So.
I see some hands up in the participant column. Chris Vyas.
Hi, Shayla, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the discussion today and for the opportunity for it. Shayla and parties, I think it might be helpful, and I know this has been touched on already a little bit, but I think as we embark on this discussion, it might be helpful if we get a little bit more specific clarification on what staff intends for this transparency guidelines document. That would help inform who should be on it and what should it look like. For example, is the idea going to be that the transparency guidelines would be similar to thought we would be looking at in some of the earlier workshops in this rulemaking, that the document will consist of things that the parties actually stipulated to, so that rather than it being an advocacy piece, it is sort of a results piece, like this is the things, if any, that the parties actually affirmatively and formally stipulated to. Or is the transparency guidelines to be a viewpoint, because there may be some honest disagreement on what transparency guidelines should be. I think it's fair to say that the utilities may, to a degree, feel that we had a long settlement agreement process. There was a lot of puts and takes. All the parties that signed on to that settlement agreement got the benefit of the bargain. And the utilities may, to a degree, feel that to the extent that there is something being added in addition to the settlement agreement, that might be more a target of, rather than being an additional requirement for, say, a ramp system. Instead, when you proceed past the settlement agreement terms and the CPUC requirements, that the utility should have some flexibility in presenting the information in the way the utility thinks is most transparent and most understandable to the CPUC and to the other key stakeholders. And then, of course, parties have a right to comment on that, to say if they think it's deficient, et cetera. But I want to be sure that we're not, under the guise of saying an interpretation, we're not doing an end around on the settlement agreement where there would be the possibility of some unilateral adding of requirements to it or to the commission's own requirements for ramp submissions. I hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to clarify anything as anyone wishes.
Yeah, so what I think you're saying, and I'm going to ask any of the RASA team members if they want to chime in, is, and what Katie's saying too, is that what we're looking for in Track 1, Phase 1 is supplemental data to help clarify some of the assumptions and the levels of data quality. And we aren't looking for changes to the settlement agreement. I think Katie is just trying to get across what extra information they would like to see, and their proposed matrix was an example of how it could be portrayed. Now, in terms of Mason's questions on who it's going to be applied to, because I know they have their ramp coming up, I'll definitely have to defer to other members of RASA staff, but in my mind, since it's due in May, a decision for phase 1, Track 1 won't come out until mid-year, so it would be after a decision on this will be after SDG or SEMPRA files its ramp. Does anyone from SPD want to chime in on clarifications on Mason or Chris's questions?
Well, this is Marty Kurtovich. Shayla has the right. The decision is mid-year, and that's after SEMPRA's filing, so it cannot apply to SEMPRA. The more appropriate question may be, how does it apply to SCE's ramp, and also does it apply to PG&E's GRC filing?
Agreed, Marty. That's part of why I'm bringing it up, is to make sure that we have clarity on what this would mean for SCE's ramp, because again, the normal process and the process that was followed in our last ramp was that we followed the CPUC's requirements. There's a full regulatory review, and the staff tests whether we met those requirements, and that beyond that, the utility has some flexibility in how it presents in order to try to put together the best product in light of the way the utility is presenting the the information, the type and nature of the particular risk analysis the utility is doing, the nuances of it, and the utility lives with it in terms of parties have the right to show where that's problematic. And I'm not saying that's the exclusive process, but that's certainly been the basic process. And certainly SCE got a lot of credit in our ramp showing for how transparent and understandable it was. And so I would just appreciate, that we stay clear on what this process is to lead to. And Katie wants to respond.
Yeah, and I think that's what my hope a working group would do. And I would hope that others would join me to help figure out the common ground. This was a suggestion based on what our data needs and concerns have been and the data requests and discovery, et cetera, we've gone through. But if the utilities have other good ways that they can highlight where they've used SME judgment or assumptions or estimates, we are open to that. But we can only be open to that when the utilities provide us a counterexample or talk to us about what's so problematic, particularly about the chart that we've provided. So I would hope that others would be open to being in a working group so that we could work collectively to, honestly, all of this is supposed to be reducing the discovery load and the work that we have to do once the ramp is filed. We're trying to make that easier. So it's not creating new requirements. It's easing the process once we're in it. So that's why it would be really nice to hear suggestions or desires to work together rather than just a roadblock.
Well, and SE certainly doesn't intend that, Katie, and we would be happy to participate, obviously, in further discussions, including if there's like a subgroup, we would be happily doing that. I think, though, that it would be helpful if we clarified that anything that we call a guidelines document that would spring from it should be something, Shayla and CPUC team, it should be something that is stipulated to by the parties, because it can't be a guideline if it's unilateral. Then it's not a guideline. Then it's a comment from a party. And so I think it would be helpful if we clarified that in advance, as we would then have further discussions either with the full working group or with some subset of it as to what would be the end product.
Hi, this is Hayat. I'm the supervisor with RASA. So I just want to clarify the intent of this document that we're envisioning. Just like we typically put out draft straw man proposal. The intent of this is going to be a TWG product from the discussions. So it might be, you can call it draft recommended guidelines, and you can name it whatever makes you comfortable. But the idea is that the team, the TWG, utilities and interveners agree on some concept of what they would like to see presented in their and then what we're envisioning happening is that once you draft that note, you can mark things like consent items and so things you didn't agree on, you can table them and provide it for the team, for RASA to review, for the staff to review.
I guess I'm still a little confused, because on the one hand, I think I heard you say that it would be what agreed to, and that's the idea that I'm trying to get at, because if you say recommended guidelines, the idea is recommended by whom? Because if it's not agreed to by the key stakeholders, then I don't believe it's a guideline. Yeah. Then it's a party's comment. That is the way that regulatory proceedings sort of run. But if it's agreed to, then I agree that it could be a guideline. I just think it might be helpful if we sort of agreed that on the ground floor rules is that the document to result would consist of recommended guidelines. And I know that would make it very streamlined then for the commission if it's guidelines that the parties have agreed to, and the parties presumably, to the extent they reach agreement, it's where it's a compromise, where one party says, well, I want this, and the other party says, here's what I can provide you, and we come to some middle ground. Where we're very happy to engage in that discussion. And Katie, I want to be clear, I was not meaning to throw up any roadblock, just seeking clarity on what it is that we should be doing so that can kind of contour who participates, how often the group meets, things like that.
Yeah, and the intent, again, we would like to see a written draft. So you're free to meet together, utilities and interveners, on your own time. We don't need to be in that discussion if you choose. But the idea is that you spearhead that effort, whether one of the utilities or Turn or whoever want to spearhead the write-up, and just have a working document, a draft that we can take a look at and as RASA team. So that the thing is that we're working with a tight schedule, so we have expectations that excuse me, according to the scoping memo, that there is some decision coming mid-year. So and these are like short-term fixes. It's not like we're going to change anything, like just clarifying, more transparency, stuff like that, things that streamline the process, as Katie said. So that's what we need to get at, and Shayla will talk about the schedule a little bit later, but that's the idea behind that.
So,
and I should say, the way I was thinking earlier when I agreed to spearhead this, and I'm open to not spearheading it, it's literally just going to send out like slide 11 and slide like 14 or whatever and ask for feedback. It wasn't, my intent was never to do less than that, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you guys decide, whether it's gonna be a list or a document or whatever you feel comfortable with, something that you all agree on. Thank you.
This is Ken from PG&E. Katie, I'm just interested, is the ultimate goal here like an interest in developing what would look like a standard work paper that people would use, making information more accessible? Excuse me. I think Chuck said that we had this information; it was part of our RAM filing. Just making sure that people have that data in a way that they can access it. That's our goal here, and that's what we want to do through these conversations.
Exactly.
Okay, with these clarifications in mind, SDG&E and SoCalGas would certainly like to have a participation in that working group.
And PG&E as well. I think we made the commitment, Katie, to Turn in previous discussions to check that, we certainly can recognize we can get better on kind of data accessibility with our work papers. We do deal with a lot of data. I think we provided just tons. So yeah, we would be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, SCE would. I think it's fair to say, Shayla and team, that the group would include Turn utilities. I think all the utilities have an interest in joining for this effort.
Perfect, thank you. Katie, would it be fair then to say, since you initially volunteered, that you would be the one maybe leading the drafting and sending it to feedback and working with communication with everyone who's interested in joining this group?
What I was foreseeing doing was something very similar to what Ken said, is developing like a standard work paper type thing. I was literally, like I said, going to send out like the graph from slide 11 and potentially slide 16 and ask for feedback on how that could be made better or different, et cetera, from the utilities. When it comes to drafting a much longer document than that, I maybe don't have the bandwidth, but I am happy to be sort of a communications point person as we develop what that, I liked how Ken put it, as a standard work paper or a standard presentation of data. I'm happy to be the point person as we develop that. If you need like a super involved defense of it, I would maybe ask for more help from others.
And I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we'd need a super long defense of the clarifications.
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, according to discussion, everyone is in agreement with what's the purpose of this document is. It's just making the data more accessible and transparent in the filings. Like, I like the idea of having a standard presentation of data. So that's no one can disagree to. The devil is in the details. Turn and the utilities can agree or disagree on certain elements of that. But the other thing is, like, something came in mind. I'm not imposing this on anyone, but it's just a suggestion. There is, maybe not for this round, maybe for this round, there is also a way where you have, you can, like in the ERA filings, we have standard data requests that the utilities fill in with and provide it with their application. So the data that you need comes in with the application. And that is also one way to handle the timing, because, you know, the data requests usually take 10 days or so or more, depending on the responses. So whatever you guys end up agreeing on, something that would work for everyone and simplify the process after the filing. So we're not like, minimizing the time spent data requesting, getting a lot of information that might be useful or might not be useful for the purpose of review of the application. So we leave the details up to you. So this is a space for the utilities and interveners to collaborate on what they would agree on at the end of the day of what this presentation looks like, whether it's a standard data request or whether it is a work paper that gets filed with the application. The end product is something you guys agree on. Thanks.
Okay, this is Chris Vias with SCE. Thank you. That clarification is helpful. I do just, as far as the ground rules, to, we're speaking of what we agree on. I would just like to be clear that the utilities are under no obligation to have to agree to something. We will agree on what we think is in the best interest of our customers, our grid, our operations, our costs, et cetera. And I would just note, just sort of a larger point, we've heard a great deal from Katie in turn, and we very much appreciate her perspectives. But TURN is not the only intervener. And if I could step into a larger point about ramp showings, and as they feed into the GRC, different interveners have somewhat different expectations or different interests. And while they may not seem to be directly related to transparency, anything that affects the substantive way the utility presents or shows things can be different for different folks. I'll give you a specific example of what I mean. Is different interveners have different views on what that risk analysis, what's to be done with it. TURN, at least in things like RG, has been comfortable with what we would call residual risk, including in areas such as wildfire, that there's some level that TURN says be comfortable with this residual risk. There are other intervener parties who say that, for example, in the area of wildfire, there should be basically no deliberate residual risk, that utilities should be allowed to spend until there is essentially no unaccounted for deliberately being left out hanging. I'm not saying today who's right or who's wrong in that discussion. I'm just saying there is such a discussion. And it's important that it be recognized that we welcome the discussion, we welcome the chance to collaborate with TURN, but I want to make sure that the expectations are set clearly, that it takes two to tango here. And if we can't agree on something, we can't agree on it. And the utility has to have that right so that it's not just a unilateral guideline. And with that, we are very, very happy to engage in further discussions, and we lead to fruitful guidelines.
Yeah, I think
This
you
is
made
Mo-
really good points here. I just want to say that so I don't know. I haven't heard from Cal advocates if they will be engaged in this process. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But
can you hear me? Hi, this is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities, and I'm a typical intervener and wanted to follow up on what Chris was just saying and really support Katie's presentation. And I agree with and appreciate almost everything that she said. And I really appreciate the clarification that Tern is discussing already existing requirements, because the discussion about what we agree on, what we don't agree on, that is all, it's besides the point. There is already a settlement agreement, and the settlement agreement requires transparency. And at a minimum, transparency means that you have to have the decision-making process understood. So I don't hear Katie discussing, some sort of inflexible mechanism or some of the things that have been feared. I'm hearing her describing a way to be transparent, which is already required. And so it's really important we don't lose sight of the fact that the transparency is a requirement, and it has already been agreed to, and it has already been entered as a decision based on that agreement. So the other thing I wanted to highlight is that I actually wanted to just confirm with Katie that the transparency, the discussion this morning was focused on the use of subject matter experts, I think, and I just wanted to highlight that doesn't change the fact that utility-specific data must still be used whenever possible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we would stand by the utilities always using the best available data. If they have data on their own utility, that's what they should rely on. We're just saying when they do use estimates and assumptions because they don't have that data, ways to transparently give other parties access to that data. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for everything that you've done.
all right, I just want to I was speaking, but I forgot what I was saying. I just want to say that the idea is that you guys maybe put some ground rules on what to include or not to include in that document, so it doesn't stifle the flow. Maybe that's something to consider. And what we're looking for is ways of presentation. So we're not changing what the utilities are doing or using or approaches that they're using. So all we're asking for is how you can make your results more transparent and explain the inputs and assumptions and things like that. So it's not changing any of the approach or the work or whatever techniques that the utilities are using or already probably done in the case of SEMPRA. So we're not, just to clarify, we're not changing any of that, just presentation of the data. Thanks.
So this is Mason from, oh, sorry, Shayla.
Oh, no, I just saw that Miles Gordon had his hand up for a while, and I'm sorry, I missed you earlier, Melinda, so I was going to ask if you want to speak.
Hi, thanks, Miles Gordon from Cal Advocates. Thanks so much for the really interesting presentation. This has been useful for us. I mean, I think to the question of participation in this process, I mean, I think it certainly would be interesting for us. I mean, it's sort of TBD based on bandwidth issues that we need to resolve on our side. But I had a specific question earlier, actually about slides 12 and 13. I don't know if we were going to go into those more later, and if so, I can ask those questions at that time if that's more appropriate.
Yes, I believe those are the slides Steve was also interested in. So if we have time at the end, we'll go into them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry to cut you off, Mason.
No, sorry. So I was going to say that I think the conversation around what transparency could look like is going to be a great conversation. I'd like to see if we could get some more information about what parties think is maybe holding that up or like preventing the transparency. What's the problem? Right now, it seems like it's a general thing that a little bit like the utilities need to do more. And I want to understand what that more is. Like, for example, what so-called lack of transparency has stopped parties from doing. So if we could see some test cases of how increased transparency would have helped the situation. Right now, it feels a little bit like a problem looking for a solution looking for a problem. So I just want to see if there's examples of how the so-called lack of transparency could be used as examples and how we can fix that problem. Because this is kind of like the first we're hearing this from our perspective. So I think the start of any good project is to figure out what's the gap analysis, what could be missing, and how to address it specifically, and not in generalizations that could be applied across the entire ramp. Because as we know, the ramp has lots of different like hidden corners to it. There's some risks that are really well understood, and there's other risks that are not as well understood, and those types of things. I just want to understand, are we focusing on like the really big spans, or are we expecting this type of transparency across every single mitigation? So that type of thing I think would be really good information to start the working group to set the expectations. Thank you.
Right.
Mason,
I
it's
was
John.
going to turn to you just real quick. But I was going to say the only utility that has put in place the settlement process is PG&E. So I was going to ask Chuck and Jonathan if they could talk about their experiences there. Keeping in mind that the only utility that has done the settlement process is PG&E.
Hi, this is Jonathan Lester. And let me just explain, Mason, what I mean, and I'll use PG&E's example. Ken knows that Chuck and I have spent hours with Vincent and their other folks and himself on data issues. We were trying to find, okay, where'd this calculation come from? How is it done? And, the PG&E folks very patiently would walk us through everything. And it took many, many hours. And I'm sure that, given how busy those staffers and Ken are, anything that makes it a little easier on them, that means we don't have to be asking repeated questions, asking for, multi-hour sessions to go through piece by piece to explain things. It saves everyone's time. So Mason, that's all the issue is. I think you're trying to make this into something far more complex and difficult than it really is. It's simply designed to save everyone a lot of time after a filing. So, the settlement says things should be transparent, and there should be enough data for us to make, or anyone to reproduce the calculations. All we're suggesting is if that's done on the front end, and that data is, the data are provided, the models are provided, and so we can see, oh, here's how the analysis was done, here's how that number is coming up, is derived, then we don't have to ask questions, we don't have to have, Zoom sessions, and take everyone's time. And that's,
Jonathan, I'd like to jump in real quick, if I could. Didn't interrupt you.
Sure.
Is that okay? I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. I was wondering, so I haven't seen the schedule, but I think PG&E would be willing to take a kind of a first shot at proof of concept here, because I think, Jonathan, with what you were saying, that makes sense. So Shayla, maybe as we get to what the dates are going to look like, and Jonathan, thank you for saying that we're busy. We are busy, but I think we can kind of take that first stab at it. I think everyone's busy, let me just say that, and then roll that out and continue that conversation, because I think we hear that message, we understand that, this is really an effort in efficiency. So, making sure people have visibility into the data that's already being provided. Some of those meetings with Vincent and Yumi, who are just, kind of technical geniuses, did involve various workbooks, information in different places. So, the message does resonate with us. We can take a stab at it if people are okay with that.
And Ken, I would I would be welcoming of someone other than us taking the first stab. I would say I would hope you would look at what we provided in the slides as you develop that, because I think we've already laid out a lot of what we'd like to see already.
And this is Melinda from Protect Our Communities. I have to express some serious concern about what Mason was saying, that transparency problems are news to SDG&E, because SDG&E is required by the decision in its last ramp proceeding on its 2019 ramp to address the deficiencies identified by the interveners in that proceeding. And one of the matters that we Protect Our Communities, spent a significant amount of time on in our comments is identifying the deficiency of failing to meet the transparency requirement in D18-12-14. So that I would urge Mason to get together with the appropriate folks and to make sure that the Protect Our Communities comments in that proceeding have been reviewed recently, because we go through specific examples of the ways that SDG&E and SoCalGas both failed transparency requirements in the in the 2019 ramp attempt. And that starts at page 15 of our April 6th, 2020 comments in I-1911, 010, and 011.
Thank you, Melinda. I see Chris Bias, you had your hand up.
Thank you. And one thing I think that we may want to also put on the backing up a step. One of the things I heard is that it would be helpful if parties can not have to ask for clarifications through a whole bunch of data requests and specific inquiries. Appreciate that. And one of the things that I think we should put on the table when we're developing any potential plans is whether there should be further workshop style walkthroughs so that the utility is presenting. And what I'm specifically thinking of is perhaps we could have a situation where the utility does an additional walkthrough of its ramp, but in advance, parties can pose questions to the utility saying, I would like you to, I didn't understand this part of your showing or your modeling. I would like at the walkthrough for you to address that. The idea is not to be trying to zing the utility, but to honestly say, here's something I didn't understand. And that way, instead of having to ask a whole bunch of data requests, the party can say, this is an area that's unclear to me, and the utility can have that as a specific subject in the walkthrough. It seems to me that that would assist a great deal in sort of bridging the gap here, because the utilities want to be transparent. We work very hard in these ramp showings. I may say we're fairly proud of the work that our teams do, and we want to be able to have that be visible. And again, as a lot of positive feedback on how readable and easy to understand our ramp was. We recognize that there are complexities in the modeling, and we're going to work to make all of that continue to be as transparent as possible. But maybe some additional walkthrough with parties giving some guidance in advance of the additional walkthrough that here's something I don't quite understand. I would like you to address it in the walkthrough. That could help in bridging this gap a little bit.
Chris, I'd submit I wasn't as involved in the PG&E ramp, but I think that kind of was what ended up happening, and it was a lot of hours of meetings. A lot.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just talking from our experience, and we did our things and answered DRs, and we didn't have such a time-consuming endeavor. So just sort of speaking from SCE's experience.
And, I think the one difference I would note is that PG&E was the first time implementing the settlement approach.
Correct.
I want to chime in. I think what I'm hearing, PG&E offered to take the first stab of maybe a draft example of, to enhance the transparency in their work, and SCE put forward maybe having further workshops. It sounds like what could happen from here, since people are now starting to have ideas, is we figure out a work plan with the smaller subset group of this technical working group who is interested in working on this. on maybe what the next steps are for guiding this process and maybe laying out some expectations for it. It sounds like that might be a little bit helpful right now, or if anyone has any other suggestions on how we could proceed or wants to talk about other options.
Can we take a 5 to 10 minute break before we get into that?
Yes, I was just about to suggest that if we agreed to this. Hearing no complaints, let's take a 8-minute break and come back at 11, and we'll jump into those discussions. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started back up now. So I thought we could first kind of recap what we're focusing on for this subgroup that's going to work on transparency guidelines. And we're not going to change anything on the settlement agreement. We are just trying to find a way that provides clarity in the RDF filings, that in a way that other interested parties could easily replicate their work. Is that correct, or does anyone want to chime in on that short summary of the goal of the subgroup? Okay, I'm not hearing any comments or concerns about it. So PG&E offered up taking the first stab at drafting some type of working paper for the group. And so I just wanted to confirm and throw out to the members of the subgroup if that would be an appropriate way to start working on this topic, or if they have other suggestions on how they would like to get started.
I mean, as I already mentioned to Ken, I hope they take into account the things that we already put out, but I think that's perfectly a great next step.
This is Miles. I just had a quick question. So in terms of that first stab, will that be sent to the entire working group list?
My idea of the subgroup was that it was going to be circulated within their group. So right now we have Turn, Sempra, PG&E, SCE as members of the subgroup. But whatever would be the best way to get everyone's comments and produce a result. So Ken, do you have any, I guess, preference on your circulation of it?
I don't know if that's for PG&E to decide. We're happy to send it to the full group if you're looking to limit it to a smaller audience for more direct feedback and then roll out to a larger group. It really depends on your process and what you want to do, Shayla.
So I think the best way would be to send it out to the smaller group and then comment. They can meet, discuss, and produce a set that they think best represents transparency guidelines that they could go by. And then after they get a finalized, agreed upon document, then we could share it back out to the wider technical working group for comment.
Okay, well, if it's only being circulated to the smaller list, then go ahead and put me down for now, please.
Okay, and it will be circulated. I think a more finalized copy will be circulated to the larger technical working group after, just in terms of feedback and comments on it.
Okay, thank you.
Also, could you also include Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities on the list? I'm not sure how much we'll be able to participate, but I would like to be included, and we'll try.
Okay.
Also, Joseph Scholl from Muskie Grade Road Alliance, please. Thank you.
Hey, Shayla, during the break, I was talking to a few people, and the WMP seems like it's kind of in the same universe, that there's mitigations going on, there's risk assessments, there's discussions, and I know that a lot of this is going on in that space too, like trying to figure out if the transparency is appropriate and how that feedback loop goes with filling in the gaps of uncertainty and all that other stuff. Somehow it might be good to either learn lessons from what they're doing or have people kind of communicate how well that's going, because I think there's something to be said about these really big risks do demand a lot more transparency, and maybe the smaller ones or the smaller mitigations or the lower dollars or maybe not as much. And I just want to learn. I want to take the whole thing into account. One thing I was thinking about was we have a lot of mitigations going on, and we think we're already being transparent, and we'd love to be as transparent as everybody thinks we should be. But if there's some things that take some more time to get that extra transparency that's not even really being asked for, I'd like to focus on where the transparency is more focused on. for example, if it took an extra hour to do a little bit more transparency on every single mitigation, that would be 600 hours. And we gladly trade that in for 20 hours of like focused transparency where people really desire it. So I just want to be smart with our time because we have a very limited set of time and resources to use. So anything we can learn from the WMP would be great. And so just resource management. I thank you for listening to my feedback.
I propose then for the subgroup to address Mason's comment, and I know there might not be consensus on it, but maybe you all could discuss and figure out if there are some areas of agreement. And then if there aren't, and there's unconsensus on a lot of it, then maybe you could note that as a group and list the items of non-consensus and people's stances, just for informational purposes, to know that you all discussed it and this was kind of the outcome of those conversations. So a decision doesn't have to be made by it, but just kind of for informational purposes. Since we're talking about the process that the subgroup is going to go through, I think it'd be appropriate to talk about the timeline for it. And so ideally, I think SPD was hoping to have a work product from the technical working group subgroup by mid-April for review. But I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on that.
Hi, Shayla. Sorry, my thing is really slow. My internet today. I just want to make a request that if we can see a working draft, even if it's not finished by end of March, and that will help us also incorporate some feedback so that we can get a draft semi-final by mid-April. We're trying to get as much of this work done ahead of the filing of RAMP because of everyone's time and everyone will be busy. So we just want to streamline this process as to the best we can. I know everyone is busy, everyone has lot on their table, but if we can agree at least to have to see some draft, even if it's not complete or polished or anything, like a working document by say March 30th, that's gonna help us big time move on with we still have the TWGs that are coming up for track 2 and the SOMs, and those are upcoming in April as well. So there is a lot of activity that's gonna happen between now and the end of April, till the end of April, sorry. Does that make sense? I know it's a bit aggressive, but we're working under aggressive timelines.
Sorry, I think that's just a touch too aggressive. You know, and I don't want to speak for Vincent and Yumi, but I know they're working on the WMP. You know, we're right in the throes of GRC, which is exceedingly busy. You know, if you ask me, and I think I'd like to talk to my team because, you know, we just volunteered to take this on, but I didn't think March. I would have thought very late April, beginning of May, to get that proposal out. I think end of March is just too tough with everything that's going on. That's just kind of where I stand right now.
I totally understand. We're on the same boat.
Ken, I have a question. Are you talking about the draft to the subgroup, or are you talking about having like a draft with everybody's comments in the subgroup?
So coming to this discussion, there is already a brief concept, right? from Turn as to what some of the metrics or some of the elements or data that they would like to see presented in the applications. So that could be a starting point. And one way that I could suggest is the utilities give feedback on something that Turn provide or whoever else. I see also Melinda Dickinson and sorry, Miles Gordon and MGRA also wanted to be added to that group. So I guess one way to deal with this is just generate a form, so people sign up to the group, whoever want to be part of this working group, start setting up like some timeline, circulate it around like a draft of this, feedback by then, and have something on paper by the end of this month. And that way we can streamline the whole process. So it could be a spreadsheet with the fields that you would like to see provided, or it could be a document, or whatever, something that a starting point that the team can work on, or the TWG group can work on. So
can I?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize. Can I recommend that we, I think on our ends, think about what this process is going to look like in our proposal, and then send that email back to this smaller group. I think you're right that there are interim deadlines we can hit maybe in the near term, which meets kind of, I think, what you're looking for. But ultimately, what we need more for kind of a more final proposal would be a little bit later on. So if the group is okay with it, we'd certainly like to take a chance at developing that process and then rolling out to everybody for their feedback.
Yeah, that's the idea, is that we start the process right now, and get something going, and reach some document maybe towards the mid or end of April, whatever works for you guys. But we would like to see a draft, initial draft. I mean, we would appreciate just our workload, and we have upcoming TWGs on track too, and so on. So if we can get something going by the end of this month, end of March, that would be great. Thanks.
And so just to be clear, you're looking for kind of structure by the end of this month, right? Like essentially, what it's going to look like, and then we have more conversations and we get to the proposal a little bit later on. That's what I heard. Yeah.
I think you guys, between you and Turn, and Turn started with something like some proposals.
This is Joseph Mitchell, MGRA. Just one very practical comment here. On March 29th, we have comments due on the wildfire mitigation plans and on phase 3 of the shutoff proceeding. I know this affects Turn, I think Protect Our Communities as well. It's pretty onerous, and I think there's a huge difference between March 30th and a few days after that, because our bandwidth prior to the submission of these will be pretty much zero, at least for MGRA. After that, we can probably spare some time to do something with it. So a little bit of pushback maybe in the first few days of April would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's doable. I mean, we just want to get the process starting. So we are on the 10th now. So I mean, I totally understand the workload of everyone here in the team, and we appreciate it. So if you would like to push it to April 2nd or something, that's fine. It's just that we have 3 weeks till we get some draft going with some level of details in terms of content, not that parties could, look at and review and give feedback on.
Real quick, this is Chris Vias with SCE. We look forward to the discussions, further discussions, and the working on the draft product in collaboration with others. I do just want to note that the idea of this is that these are to be guidelines. They are to be followed as reasonably feasible, but I do think that there will need to be a little bit of flexibility built in as circumstances warrant, because, for example, SCE's next ramp is going to look a little different from the other utilities because due to the rescheduling, if you will, of the GRC cycle that came out of the rate case plan proceeding, we have to incorporate year 2024 into our next showing. So it's going to look, in that sense, rather different. And in addition, the scope of this very proceeding contemplates that in phase 2, I believe it is, we will be contemplating the stakeholders whether modifications to the MAVF are warranted, and if so, what they might be. That could in turn affect these guidelines themselves. So I just think that we may want to build in some provisions from the beginning of the draft, and SCE is happy to help craft that. That would be, mentioned that, as circumstances warrant, we may, that these are guidelines to be followed as it makes sense. And then I think we can then see, in light of those guidelines, for example, how things perform then in the utility's next ramp showings. And then those guidelines we can see what works and what doesn't. And maybe at that time, then we could move towards something firmer after we see what really works and what doesn't. Just
absolutely. I agree. I think that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
So based off of this discussion, I'm wondering if it'd be helpful for the subgroup if SPD writes an email to all of you kind of recapping our discussion and the thoughts and expectations of the subgroup, and maybe the proposed dates that I put out there, and our thoughts for what we could maybe see as in terms of work products. Now hearing all of the comments about people's workloads and concerns, because we want to be mindful of those. Do you think that'd be helpful, or do you all have a clear understanding?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to us. We would certainly like an opportunity to kind of comment on the process, but I think a recap and structure would be ultimately helpful to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. I think with that, does anyone have any additional input they want to provide based on this discussion and what we're working towards? I know we kind of jumped to next steps kind of early, but I want to make sure we didn't miss anything before.
One quick housekeeping item. You may have already seen this, but the Coalition of California Utility Employees in the chat, Andrew Graff asked that Q be added to the sub-working group. That's in the chat.
Okay, yes, I missed that. Thank you for noting that. So now, just to make sure I didn't miss anyone, we have a Coalition of California Utility Employees. We have MGRA, TURN, Cal Advocates, Protect Our Communities, SEMPRA, PG&E, and SCE. Is there anyone I missed on that list?
You can, please.
You can. You can. Okay.
Shayla, were there any outstanding questions in the chat that need to be answered? I'm just trying to scroll through.
Yeah, let me see. How do we subscribe to the subgroup? I think I don't see any. There was a question about RSE granularity, but I think it would be best to finish closing out some of the items for the subgroup before we go back to Katie's presentation. So I just mentioned everyone's name. Could I get a representative to send the email to from each organization?
For Cal Advocates, that'd be me, is Miles.
And
Okay.
Katie for turn.
Thank you.
Hi, Shayla. For Sempra, it'll be Josh Stewart.
Yeah, Eric Wojcik for UCAN. I'll send you email. Thanks.
Melinda Dickinson for Protect Our Communities.
Hi, Shayla. For SCE, can you please send it to Dan Kamala and to myself, please?
Mm-hmm.
For MGRA, Joseph Mitchell, please.
Perfect. And is it Andrew Graff for Coalition of California Utility Employees? Is that correct, Andrew?
I'm not sure if Andrew Graff has speaking, but he would be the person for Q. And I'll send him an email at the conclusion of this session, just letting him know that he's the service list for Q, so to speak, for this. I'll take care of that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we have our list, and we'll get an email out confirming and recapping what we agreed on with some potential dates to see work products or draft work products. I think then that kind of captured what we wanted to cover for today's technical working group, but I know there was a question earlier that we didn't answer, Katie, about RSE granularity. So I think we could take the time now. If people want to do a deeper dive into Katie's presentation, we can.
The question was, how does the argument about the importance of RSE granularity down to individual asset segments apply to the size of tranches and use of average LOR and core values within a tranche? I'm going to let Chuck also, or Jonathan also take this, but I think for, I think it would follow from wanting to have more granular RSE that we also want to have more granular LOR and core that reflect the attributes and the condition of individual assets within the tranche. So I think our concern about averaged RSEs is also a concern about LOR and core being averaged and not looking at individual mitigations and assets, if I've understood the question correctly. Chuck, Jonathan, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Chuck, we did an analysis of PG&E's analysis of the risk associated with fires over a tranche that contained approximately 25,000 miles of conductor, of wire of various kinds. And what we found was that if that tranche were divided in some way, we could attribute something like 80% of the effectiveness of the mitigation to about 20% of the size of the tranche. And so sub-tranches suggest in this analysis, and we don't claim that what we have is the final or correct or absolutely right answer. We just observed that if we were able to decompose a large tranche into pieces, that the risk mitigation was not uniformly attributed to the tranche. And that was the point we were trying to make. Another point we made, which is associated with an earlier analysis we did in the test drive, was that it's fundamentally important to look at asset condition, because asset condition is an important input into assessing the likelihood of failure of an asset. And so if a tranche contains assets of different conditions, then once again, an averaging process occurs that will not get at the effect of a mitigation when that mitigation is focused on assets that vary by condition to get at the ones that are perhaps most likely to fail. So averaging process misses all of these distinctions that a finer granularity of tranches would pick up.
Do we have any follow-up questions or comments from that response?
Is Turn satisfied with how they're doing it, the risk modeling and the wildfire mitigation plan?
I don't know, because of the limitations of resource constraints that we're going to go so deeply into how they're doing it in the wildfire mitigation plan necessarily, but we last year have said, and we will continue to say, that the commission, or the Wildfire Safety Division now, I guess, should be following the ramp and the SMAP, and requiring things to be done in a similar way. And so I'm not going to speak to the specifics, but I would say that we think that doing it correctly is important, and that's across the different utilities. And I will also say that I think I personally have some concerns about what appears to be a divergence in process between the ramp and what is in the WMP for PG&E.
In terms of information they provided, or how so?
The WMP shows like a very big shift in the highest, the identification of the riskiest circuits. I'm speaking a little off the cuff here, so I may have some of the details a little off. And that, if I recall correctly, it's like the highest risk circuits that were identified in the WMP this year, almost wholly a different set of circuits than were identified last year. Which,
do you know why that is?
They say it's because of the data inputs that they're using and the machine learning. I'm not focused on PG&E, so I haven't done more on that at this moment, but it does sort of raise some questions, and maybe someone else who's been looking more closely at it can speak to that.
This is Joseph Mitchell, MGRA. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I've been digging through it as well, and yeah, it is because the PG&E has completely changed its risk prioritization by switching to a machine learning algorithm. I'll be presenting what we've discovered with it on March 29th when we put in our comments. To suffice to say, we have some concerns with some of the assumptions, not so much the fact that it's machine learning, that's fine, but that some of the assumptions going into those models are of concern, and we'll be raising that. And we would suggest that other parties take a close look at some of the assumptions that PG&E is making as well.
This is Eric Wojcik, if I can just real quick to say that UCAN is concerned about the wildfire modeling, that it doesn't have enough granularity, and particularly when you look at what actually happened in the many fires. I'm in Lake County right now on Highway 20. The firefighters, as I said before in comments, were so successful in going to particular assets, protecting those places, and were just did a phenomenal job. And then a whole bunch of other places burned that were sort of didn't have assets or people or buildings and those things. And I just am not convinced that the wildfire modeling will have that kind of granular detail, so you can really weigh the risks and then bring that up through the this particular analysis we're talking about now with core lore and costs. So thank you for listening.
One thing I'd just like to raise, just sort of fundamentally, as an issue that will be affecting are these MABF calculations as we go forward with regard to machine learning, is that these machine learning algorithms are sort of a synthetic model where a lot of different types of data are input. So, you know, asset age, condition, location, histories of weather, you know, all sorts of things are integrated in, and an answer comes out. And it's not really possible to put your finger on, you know, what the ranking is for a particular decision that the machine learning model made based on all of those inputs. So while you could potentially tranche that output, you could have very different ingredients going into the inputs. And in order to actually evaluate, for instance, the effect of a mitigation, it would require potentially a rerunning of the machine algorithm to sort of rebalance all of these different things taken in conjunction with each other. It's not really clear how these things are going to fit together going forward. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to handle it now. But that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward, how this whole approach to risk and mitigations is going to need to change as we start adapting to these machine learning models.
Is one of the shortcomings of machine learning is it's only as good as the data that's input into it. And I know at least one of the IOUs has had a history of having either not having data or having bad data. So does that affect the machine learning results?
Of course, and also it is basically what we're looking at with BG&E is the variables that they're actually looking at. We don't think those are necessarily optimized to produce the best result for wildfire risk. I don't want to go into too much detail on that, but that's a sneak preview of what we'll be saying on March 29th. It's assumptions, the variables that are used, and so forth, and also the data quality. Yes, all of these affect the output of the models, and it's not necessarily transparent. We're talking about transparency today of how it gets from point A with all of these variables to point B with an answer, because there's this big fuzzy cloud in the middle, which is optimized. I mean, these are good models that do actually come up with an optimized solution, but it's just not really clear how they, you know, from the outside, how they get there.
And I would add, the utilities are always trying to improve their modeling. We talk about machine learning, and it's not like we run the machines once and then we're done. So there's always going to be updates, and those updates will feed through to our different understanding of how the risks look. And to Katie's point, you'd hope that the representation that we put forward is the most recent one, and it's consistent in the way that the granularity is shown and the methods used. But we have the ramps every 3 or 4 years, and then the WMPs are every year, and then the GRC follows the ramp. It's not unexpected that the results look a little different, because that's when you're updating your models. But you'd hope that the utilities are using their most recent ones in their filings, and it can explain the adaptation since the last public showing of that data. And to Joe's point, it is a tricky thing, and the feedback loops that are established with the machine learning, we're going to fine tune for 20 years. We'll be still fine tuning these models, probably on a more than annual basis.
I'm looking through the chat right now, and there's a lot of questions in there. I think we got to them all, but I'm not entirely sure. If your question was not answered in the chat, could you please either speak up or add another message to the chat letting us know? I'm gonna wait a few minutes to see if something pops up in the chat, or a few seconds. I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat or anyone speak up. So since we do have a little bit extra time, Steve, you had a question earlier that you wanted to ask, but I asked that we table it to the end. Did you want to dive into that right now, or would you like to save it for another time?
Hey, Shayla, it's not so much a question. I was just interested in having Chuck go through those slides that he skipped over, if we have time, and if there is general interest for having Chuck to go through those slides, yes. But otherwise, we can defer that to another discussion. I have no problem with that too.
Okay, does anyone else have an interest in that, or would we like to defer it to another time?
This is Miles. I'd be interested in those as well.
Yeah, you can, Eric. Interested, thanks.
Okay.
And, can I just, before Chuck does that, I just again want to highlight that this was us trying to provide additional context in the kinds of questions that we would like answered. It is by no means meant to change the requirements of the settlement. It was the types of questions that one would ask to help identify offenses where additional transparency would be helpful.
Thank you, Katie, for the clarification. I think we can then dive into them and people could start asking questions, but just note this isn't the focus for the subgroup as of right now. And we are also going to have a hard stop at 12, so we'll cap conversations then. So we could turn it over back to Katie and your team.
Great. If we want to go to slide 12, I think is the first one, and I will hand it over to Chuck to discuss how that slide is identifying the information that would go into the chart on slide 11.
Is the slide up? I don't see it. Okay. So we need to go another few slides down. Okay, perhaps you could stop there. So you may recall that our suggestion is that all the information about estimates, assumptions, and inputs is presented in a matrix. Each cell of the matrix has information that would tell us something about the cost, the consequence, the likelihoods in a particular period, and we're using years. On the next slide, we talk about how to report the uncertainty in that information. So if I could have that one, please.
If we go to slide 12, please.
Yes, slide 12. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's suppose that we're thinking about what would go into the cell for cost in a particular year. If the cost is certain, then just report the number. So then if cost were certain for all of future years from periods 1 through T, the cost row would be just a sequence of numbers. If the costs are uncertain, then report the probability distribution of the cost in each period for each cell. Now, how do you report a probability distribution? You have fundamentally two choices. You can report the probability distribution as some named distribution with parameters like a normal or a log normal or an exponential or any probability distribution you like. Now, it is possible that the parameters of the probability distribution themselves are uncertain. So if you report, say, a normal distribution or the underlying normal for a log normal, you might say, well, I think the mean is some number like 1,000,000, but I'm not exactly certain about that mean. So the mean itself could be uncertain. Okay, if that's the case, report the probability distribution on the uncertain parameters. So now you've got at least two probability distributions. You've got one on the cost itself, and then you've got another one on the mean of the distribution of the cost. Perfectly fine. Another approach to reporting the probability distribution is just using percentiles. We have found over the years, and this is just a suggestion based on practice, this is not something that I would ever impose as a requirement on someone, speaking for myself, but our preferred approach is just to report the 10, 50, 90 percentiles of a distribution of the cost for each year. If the percentiles themselves are uncertain, then report probability distribution on those uncertain percentiles. So you might say that the 10th percentile of a cost is $1 million a year, but that 10th percentile itself could be distributed in some way, and I would write down the probability distribution of the 10th percentile. And there are ways of doing that, but in principle, it's quite all right to have a distribution described by percentiles and then describe the uncertainty in the percentiles themselves in the same way that you could have a probability distribution with parameters and then describe the uncertainty in those parameters. You have to be careful to do it correctly in order to get the math to work, but it's a straightforward process to find out what experts are uncertain about. In the next slide, can I have the next one, please?
Chuck, pardon me, this is Eric Wojcik with UCAN. I just want to make a point, and I tried to say it, I think, or ask the question in the chat. The costs are always uncertain. The probability distribution is probably always uncertain. And we keep acting academic as though, oh, it might not be. Sorry, I don't think so. Can you say something about that?
Sure. I think it's reasonable to say that we're uncertain about a future cost. I think it's also reasonable to say that we could write down a probability distribution for that future cost. So we might be willing to say that the future cost of some mitigation in the 15th year is normally distributed with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 6. Now, you might further say, you know, I don't know about that mean of 100. That mean of 100 I'm uncertain about. And I will give you something like a beta distribution on that mean of 100, or I'll give you some other probability distribution on that. And I'm perfectly willing to accept the notion that you could be uncertain about a cost and then uncertain about the way to describe it. And that's all we're getting at. Shall I go on?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
Dr. Feinstein, this is Mason. Are you thinking in terms of the cost per unit, or how are you thinking about that? Sometimes
anything you like. It's any cost that you want to describe for the mitigation. You have to write down the cost of the mitigation somehow. And so whatever the mitigation does, you have to pay for it. And these are the costs of the mitigation over the uncertain future, which is what you have been doing in the materials that you've been submitting. So again, this, as Katie has said before, none of this is new ground. This is just what you've already done. Essentially, we're asking or suggesting that all of these assumptions and inputs be put in one place. So it'd be easy for third-party people to verify what you've done or replicate it. Could I have the next slide, please? The likelihood of the risk event is a probability if it can occur at most once in each year. So I'm going to think about risk events that I believe can occur at most once. So if there's a risk event that can occur at most once in each year, report the probability of that event. So you're reporting a number. Now let's suppose that you've estimated that probability by SMEs. Well, what the SMEs have given you then is an underlying probability distribution on the relative frequency of occurrence of this risk event. Assuming that's the way you've assessed the information that the SMEs provide. So you have probability distributions on the relative frequency of the event. And if you've got several SMEs, you could have several probability distributions on the relative frequency of the event. Just report those. So now you've got either a point, an estimate of, or a specification of the probability in each year, or a collection of probability distributions on relative frequency given by the SMEs. Either one is satisfactory as far as we're concerned. And we can then use that information to compute what you've computed and replicate it. Suppose the risk event can occur more than once in each year. That's, in a lot of the cases, that's what we've seen. If that's so, just report the probability distribution on the number of occurrences. And again, you have two possibilities. Either report it as a named distribution or report it using percentiles. The named distribution, most of the time, people have been using so far is a Poisson. We have no objection to that at all. So you have a Poisson distribution with a parameter. If you're uncertain about the parameter, then write down the probability distribution on that parameter as well. So again, the second level of uncertainty is quite possible if you're reporting the likelihood of occurrence of a risk event. So this looks just like what we asked to report for the costs. Again, no new ideas here, and this is the information that you either already have or expect to get when you're reporting your uncertainty. The idea here is that all we're asking for or suggesting is that you report the uncertainties in a way where we can easily find what you're reporting.
Dr. Feinstein, this is Miles. I have a quick clarifying question. So you talk about mentioning, you talk about reporting as a named distribution or as percentiles. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, like, how you're differentiating those and what report, like percentiles of what?
Good question. Good question. So here in the risk event, if you believe the risk event can occur more than once each year, you might say that the median number of risk events is 7. So that means I'd be willing to bet at even odds that there'd be more or less than 7 events that occur in each year. And I might also say that the 10th percentile of that distribution is 1. So I might say odds are 9 to 1 that there'll be more than one of those events each year. And similarly, I might say the 90th percentile is 14. So I'd be willing to bet at odds of 9 to 1 that there is no more than 14 of these events. There's a 10, 50, 90 percentile on the probability distribution on the number of events that could occur in each year. And now you might say, well, I'm not quite sure about the 50th percentile being 7. So what I'll do is I'll write a probability distribution down for that. And I might use something like a beta distribution that goes from 5 to 8. And I will write down a beta distribution on the expected number or the median number of these occurrences. And I'll say I have a probability distribution. I'll call it a beta. It goes from 5 to 8. I'll write it down and I'm done. So now I've given you not only the probability distribution in terms of 3 percentiles, but I've also given you a probability distribution on, say, the median. Why do we use 10, 50, 90? Because that works very well in practice. People are able to do what is called over-under relatively easily. People are able to assess extreme events that occur at odds of 9-1 relatively easily or with confidence. There are lots of other ways to do it. Your practice may be different than mine, but that is something that we have found to be reasonable. And why use a 10, 50, 90? Because people aren't willing to, some people, at some occasions, aren't willing to say, well, I know it's a log normal distribution, or I know it's a normal distribution, or I know it's a hypergeometric or something like that. No, people are not willing to be constrained like that. They're just willing to tell me what odds they're willing to bet that these things occur at. So it depends on what's in the expert's head or what data you have. And if you have data, we can always create an empirical distribution. And you can always extract percentiles from data. It depends on what a person has and what a person wants to report. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I guess I'm just wondering. So like, you're sort of differentiating this percentile approach versus doing a named distribution with parameters. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like the percentile approach is being offered such that folks wouldn't have to name the distribution they're using?
Yes, because when you name a distribution, you're really saying a lot. You're saying about, you're telling us about how the probability of an event or a range or occurrence, depending on whether or not it's a continuous or discrete distribution, behaves over the entire sample space. And some people are not willing to say that. Some people are willing to say, well, I only know that I'm willing to bet at some odds for different values or different levels across the sample space. It's just a question of what people are willing to express or what they know or what they believe. Now, in some cases, you're constrained to report a named distribution because you're dealing with something like a sum or something like a product. And so you know how those are supposed to behave theoretically. And so you're using that distribution to fit data.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. And I think the next slide is the consequence slide. So may I have that one, please? Oh, sorry. I guess we passed over the consequence slide. It is, again, the same. For the consequence, I think that's 2 slides back. Right, no, one more to the right, one more down. That's, keep going. One more. No, sorry, that's the wrong direction.
We're going the wrong way, yeah.
Okay. There was one more slide. I think it's 2 or 3 slides up that spoke about consequences, but the idea is the same.
13, Chuck.
13. Thank you, Katie. I don't know the number. Slide 13, please.
Hi, this is Sean with IT support. This is actually slide 13 from what I'm showing. Or this is 18. Sorry. 13.
Dr. Feinstein, while we're finding that slide, let's say we had a mitigation and the lower we think was a 10, 50, 90 was 2, 5, and 8 risk events a year. And for the purposes of RSE calculations, we use the 5 because that's, let's assume that's the expected value. Could you give us some insight what you would be doing with the 2 and the 8?
Sure. First of all, the 5, then you're telling me not the median, you're telling me the expected value. So you've directly assessed the expected value and you've said it's 5 in your example.
Sure.
Okay. If that's the case, then the definition of the risk is the expected value of the likelihood of occurrence of the event multiplied by the expected value of the consequences. So you've told me that you expect 5 events. Let's suppose the consequences are 100 weighted risk units. So you're telling me that the expected value of the LORE times the CORE is 500. I am now done.
So what would you be doing with the 2 and the 8?
Like I said, there's no reason to consider it because you've already told me the expectation. If, on the other hand, you've told me that the 5 is the median, so you've given me 10, 50, 90s, 2, 5, and 8, then I would use 2, 5, and 8 to compute the mean. And in fact, in that particular case, the mean is approximately 3/10 times 2 plus 4/10 times 5 plus 3/10 times 8. So the
Okay.
extreme values and the median all come together to inform you about what the mean is. Once I have the mean, I perform the calculation. The calculation is the expected value of the LORE as the expected value of the CORE. That's the risk.
So you're using the range, the 10, 50, and 90 to generate the expected value, essentially.
Of course. Yes. If you specify 10, 50, 90s, then I use them to compute the mean. If you specify the mean itself, there's nothing further to compute.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about uncertainties here, we're saying there's a 10% chance, for example, that it's a 2 instead of a 5. But you're not using that in any way. You're just taking the 5. You're using the 2, 5, and 8 to generate the 5, and then using the 5 henceforward, and not looking back to the 2 and 8 for any application.
Once you have told me that you have a symmetric distribution with 10, 50, 90s at 2, 5, and 8, you've told me that the expected value is 5.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. This slide is the slide for the consequences, and here what we propose is what you already do, and that is to write down the uncertainty in the attribute levels. So if you believe the attribute levels are certain, then just write them down. If you believe the attributes are uncertain, then report the probability distributions. And once again, you can report the probability distributions on the level of the attributes, and you can also, if you want to, report probability distributions on either the parameters of the name distribution or on the locations of the 10, 50, 90 percentiles. It depends on what you know, depends on what you're uncertain about. But the point of these 3 slides is that there's a straightforward way to report the uncertainty, and one can easily recognize 2 levels of uncertainty. So there's the uncertainty in the variable itself, and then there's the uncertainty on how that uncertainty is described. That's the content of those 3 slides.
Thank you for presenting on them. Given that we only have 1 minute left, I think we should wrap up right now unless anyone has any outstanding questions.
I have one follow-up question. Shayla, I have one follow-up question to both Chuck and Mason. Mason earlier stated during Chuck's presentation that Mason is interpreting these discussions as new requirements outside of the settlement agreement requirements. Given this characterization from SEMPRA, does TURN intend to request this type of presentation format as a data request in the upcoming GRC? And if so, the follow-up question to Mason is, would SEMPRA be able to provide this type of information in a TURN request?
I think that TURN would potentially provide a data request along these lines to pull out the information that's in slide 11. If it's not otherwise presented by SEMPRA in a way that it's easy to identify the assumptions and the estimates used.
Okay. And what about Mason's take on it?
Hey, Steve, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think we would have the ability to tell you what we were thinking when we came up with the expected value, whether it's exactly the format that Dr. Feinstein just presented or another format. I think, there is an art to coming up with expected value, and we'd like to explain how we came up with that value, whether we put it in the ramp itself, or we await data requests to get that data, we will be able to provide that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. This concludes our technical working group meeting number 2 for track 1. Before we leave, I'd really like to thank IT for all the support and Alicia for the technical support for this, and Arnold Sohn from RASA for all the prep work that he did behind this as well. So thank you everyone for your participation, and we look forward to our next technical working group meeting with you.
Thank you, Shayla. I'm sorry. Thank you, Shayla, and thank you to this entire CPUC team. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really useful for us.